Beneath the scorching, eternal sands of the Egyptian desert lies Saqqara. To the living, it is an ancient city of the dead, a place where the shadows of Djoser's step pyramid have measured the relentless march of millennia. But hidden from the sun, buried beneath the tombs of nobles and the monuments of pharaohs, lies another city. This is not a metropolis you will find in any tourist guide. No wide, sunlit avenues lead to its gates. Its halls are not adorned with gold or vibrant frescoes celebrating the triumphs of kings. Its streets are an endless, suffocating labyrinth of narrow tunnels, roughly hewn from the soft, yielding limestone bedrock. Its population numbers in the millions, and every last one of them is dead. Before we dive in, just a quick reminder that a simple like and subscribe is the best way to support the channel. Thank you so much for being here. In 1850, the French archaeologist Auguste Mariette, a man driven by a singular obsession to find the lost Serapeum, the legendary necropolis of the sacred Apis bulls, was excavating in the sands of Saqqara. While clearing yet another blockage of sand and stone debris, his workers accidentally breached a wall. An entrance was revealed. From the abyss, an air trapped for 2.5 millennia rushed out to greet them. It was a physical presence, dry, heavy and acrid, thick with the smell of tomb dust, sweet bitumen, and eternity itself. In the trembling, unreliable light of an oil torch, what Mariette and his team beheld was a scene that defied human comprehension, a sight that bordered on the grotesque. Lining the walls of the narrow corridors, which plunged into a darkness that seemed to go on for kilometers, were they. Countless unending rows of terracotta pots, each one conical, each sealed with a simple plaster plug. They were stacked with methodical precision in niches carved directly into the rock, from the dusty floor to the low, oppressive ceiling. Hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands. Each clay jar was an individual coffin. Each coffin held a mummy. But as the team soon discovered, the bodies inside were not human. They were birds. This shocking discovery was merely the first glimpse of a phenomenon on an almost geological scale. In the decades that followed, similar subterranean necropolises were unearthed across the length of Egypt, at Tuna el-Gebel, the grand necropolis of the god Thoth, at Abydos, the holy city of Osiris, at Kom Ombo, the sanctuary of the crocodile god. Archaeologists very quickly stopped counting the individual mummies. It was a futile effort. They began to measure the deposits in tons, in cubic meters. Modern conservative estimates place the total number of birds ritually murdered, mummified, and interred in these catacombs at over 8 million. 8 million mummies. To truly grasp the scale of this figure, imagine an assembly line working 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. If you were to stand at the entrance of one of these catacombs and retrieve one mummified bird every single minute without ever stopping to eat or sleep, it would take you over 15 years of continuous work just to count them. This was not simply a religious ritual. This was an industry. It was a vast, complex, and powerful sector of the ancient Egyptian economy, a gargantuan, well-oiled machine that operated for nearly 1,000 years. And its singular, obsessive purpose was to provide an eternal afterlife not for pharaohs, queens, or viziers, but for one specific creature, the African sacred ibis. This is the story of a deity that walked the earth on 2 spindly legs. It is the story of a civilization gripped by a religious obsession that has no parallel in human history. And it is the story of the greatest, most tragic paradox in Egypt's long chronicle. How could an animal so profoundly revered, a creature whose accidental killing was punishable by a brutal public execution, vanish so completely, so utterly from the very land it once defined? This is a forensic investigation into the life, death, and disappearance of a god. To understand the sheer scale of this industrial-scale devotion, one must first understand what the ibis was to an ancient Egyptian, whether he was a farmer tilling the black soil, a priest chanting in a temple, or the pharaoh himself, the living embodiment of a god. This was not merely a striking wading bird. It was the physical, tangible, living incarnation, the Ba, or earthly avatar, of one of the most powerful, ancient, and universally worshipped gods in the entire Egyptian pantheon. His name was Jehuti, known to the Greeks, and to us as Thoth. Thoth was not a god of raw, conspicuous power like Ra, the blistering sun, or Horus, the god of war and kingship. His dominion was far more subtle, yet it was arguably more profound and all-encompassing. Thoth was the divine intellect. He was the god of knowledge, wisdom, magic, mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. He was the architect of the heavens and the measure of the earth. According to the theologians of Hermopolis, his primary cult center, it was Thoth's voice that first shattered the primordial silence of the pre-creation chaos, his words alone bringing the universe into structured existence. In Egyptian belief, it was Thoth who, in the mists of antiquity, gifted humanity with the words of God. Medu Netjer, the sacred hieroglyphs. He was the divine scribe, the celestial archivist who, in the halls of the gods, recorded the annals of time and fate, inscribing upon the scroll of eternity all that was, all that is, and all that ever will be. His patronage extended to all intellectual pursuits. He was the protector of scribes, who held an elite status in Egyptian society as the masters of the sacred written word. He was the patron of architects who designed the pyramids, the physicians who blended healing potions, and the magicians who invoked his secret names to bend reality. His most critical role, however, played out in the afterlife. In the solemn Hall of Two Truths, when a deceased soul stood judgment before Osiris, it was Thoth who presided over the scales. On one side, the heart of the deceased, on the other, the single white feather of Ma'at, the goddess of truth, order, and cosmic balance. As the jackal-headed Anubis adjusted the balance, it was Thoth, ibis-headed and holding a scribe's palette, who impassively recorded the verdict. He was the ultimate arbiter of a soul's eternal fate. This divine association was not random. The ancient Egyptians were masters of natural observation and profound symbolism. First, there was the lunar connection. Thoth was a lunar deity, a counter to the sun god Ra. He governed the cycles of the moon, which in turn governed the measurement of time in the Egyptian calendar. In the elegant downward curve of the ibis's black sickle-shaped beak, the Egyptians saw a perfect terrestrial reflection of the crescent moon. Second, there was the scribal connection. They observed the ibis for hours as it patiently waded through the shallows of the Nile. It would methodically, repeatedly probe the fertile black mud with its long, sensitive beak, searching for hidden food, snails, worms, amphibians. This patient, meticulous action was a perfect mirror of the scribe's calamus, reed pen, dipping into black ink and just as patiently probing the surface of a papyrus scroll, searching for hidden wisdom and bringing order from the blankness. The bird seeking sustenance in the dark, murky silt became the perfect symbol for the sage seeking truth in the chaos and ignorance of the world. Finally, there was a third, far more practical and vital reason for the ibis's deification, its life-giving connection. Ancient Egypt, as the historian Herodotus famously wrote, was the gift of the Nile. The entire civilization, its wealth, its power, its very existence, depended entirely on a single annual event. The Akhet, the inundation of the great river. A weak flood meant drought, withered crops, and horrific famine. A flood that was too strong was a destructive deluge, washing away villages and destroying harvests. Predicting the precise timing and strength of this event was the nation's single most important existential concern. And the Egyptians, observing their world with keen eyes for millennia, noticed an infallible pattern. The mass arrival of vast flocks of sacred ibises flying in from the south was the true and certain harbinger of the coming flood. The birds were not just birds, they were a living oracle. They were the divine messengers of Thoth, announcing that the life-giving waters laden with precious black silt were on their way to renew the land. They brought not just water, but the promise of Ma'at, of order, renewal, and life itself. The sanctity of the ibis was absolute and non-negotiable. Herodotus, visiting Egypt in the 5th century BCE, wrote with unconcealed astonishment in his histories, "Whoever kills an ibis or a hawk, whether intentionally or not, is inevitably put to death." Imagine for a moment a modern law decreeing a mandatory death sentence for a driver who accidentally hits a pigeon or a seagull. This single fact reveals the fanaticism of the cult, how deeply it was woven into the very fabric of society. Ibises roamed freely through temple complexes and city streets, protected and revered. They were fed choice offerings of fish and bread by priests. They were untouchable. They were, in the most literal sense, living gods. And as gods, they were entitled to the same privilege as a pharaoh, eternal life. It was this profound theological imperative that gave birth to the staggering phenomenon discovered at Saqqara. The Egyptians mummified many other sacred animals, cats as avatars of Bastet, crocodiles for Sobek, falcons for Horus, and most famously, the colossal Apis bulls, whose burials were events of national importance. But no other animal cult in history, anywhere in the world, ever approached the sheer, mind-boggling industrial scale of the sacred ibis. This was a full-fledged pilgrimage economy. A believer facing illness, a legal dispute, or simply wishing to give thanks would not just say a prayer to Thoth. They would travel to one of his great cult centers, like Saqqara or Tuna El Gabel. There they would purchase a votive offering, a physical manifestation of their prayer. This offering was a mummified ibis. The mummy was a sacred messenger, a conduit, which the priests would then ceremonially enter in the catacombs, ensuring the pilgrim's prayer was delivered directly to the god in the afterlife. The demand was insatiable, and an entire infrastructure rose to meet it. This industry employed tens of thousands of people across generations. There were priests who oversaw the rituals and managed the necropolis, embalmers who specialized in the avian mummification process, potters who churned out millions of identical, standardized conical jars, weavers who produced the tens of millions of meters of linen bandages required, scribes who wrote the papyrus contracts for the sale and burial of the birds, and laborers who carved the endless kilometers of new catacombs as the old ones filled up. The mummification itself, while simplified from the human ideal, was meticulous. The bird's body was desiccated in a bath of natron, a natural salt blend that wicked away all moisture, preventing decay. Sometimes the organs were removed and separately embalmed in miniature canopic jars. More often, they were left inside. The dried-out corpse was then anointed with hot, dark resins and aromatic oils, which acted as antibacterial and antifungal sealants. Finally, the bird was carefully wrapped. This was the most visible part of the art. The body was encased in dozens of meters of fine linen strips, often applied in intricate, beautiful geometric patterns. The head was frequently given special attention, sometimes even covered with a small, painted mask of plaster or cartonnage, sculpted to accentuate the ibis's long, iconic beak. Once sealed in its custom-made pot, the prayer was ready for delivery to eternity. For centuries, this process, and the staggering numbers it produced, led scholars to a single, logical, and universally accepted conclusion. The central question was obvious: where did they get all the birds? How could any society procure millions of specimens of a single species for centuries without driving it to immediate extinction? The answer seemed self-evident. The Egyptians, being brilliant engineers and master organizers, must have farmed them. This theory painted a picture of vast temple-run ibis farms, or hatcheries. It envisioned huge enclosures near the temples of Thoth, where tens of thousands of ibises were domesticated, bred in captivity, and raised specifically for the ritual market. It was a neat, rational explanation. It presented the ancient Egyptians as pragmatic and enterprising, creating a sustainable supply chain to meet a colossal religious demand, much as we farm chickens or turkeys today. This theory held sway for decades, and the first wave of modern science seemed to prove it correct. For most of history, the only way to know what was inside a mummy was to unwrap it, a process that is by its nature destructive and barbaric. But the advent of medical imaging, specifically computed tomography, CT scanning, changed everything. In the late 20th and 21st centuries, researchers could finally perform digital autopsies. A 3,000-year-old ibis mummy, sealed in its linen shroud, could be placed inside a state-of-the-art scanner. On a computer screen, scientists could peel back the layers, reconstructing the bird's skeleton and soft tissues in perfect 3D. The findings were both fascinating and chilling. First, regarding the cause of death, the vast majority of the birds had not died of natural causes. The scans clearly showed cervical vertebrae that were dislocated or shattered, or fine bones in the skull that had been crushed. This was ritual sacrifice, a quick, violent death, likely a practice snap of the neck. Second, regarding the age at death, overwhelmingly, the mummies were young but mature, juveniles and young adults in their physical prime. At first, this evidence massively supported the farming hypothesis. It was logical. You would cull the birds at a specific ideal age for the market, and you would use a quick, efficient, and standardized method of killing. As scientists scanned more and more mummies, however, they began to find anomalies, curiosities, strange inconsistencies. Inside some of the most beautifully and elaborately wrapped mummies, there was no ibis at all. Researchers found dummy mummies filled with nothing but a random assortment of loose feathers and a few bones. Some contained only mud and reeds. Others contained skeletons of entirely different birds like hawks or chickens, passed off as the sacred ibis. These were fakes. This discovery was a profound revelation. It was the first hard evidence of fraud, a tantalizingly human detail. Even in the most sacred of religious industries, there were charlatans, swindlers, and corner cutters looking to make a quick profit from a gullible pilgrim. But it also posed a serious problem for the farming hypothesis. If you have a perfectly controlled, sustainable supply of farmed birds, why would you ever need to create fakes? The existence of counterfeit mummies strongly implied a volatile, unreliable supply chain, one where demand frequently and dramatically outstripped supply. The final answer lay hidden in the very building blocks of life. An international team of scientists from Australia, Canada, and Egypt undertook a new revolutionary study. They managed to extract tiny fragmented samples of ancient DNA from dozens of ibis mummies, sourced from different necropolises and spanning different centuries. The task was incredibly complex. Over millennia, the fragile DNA molecule shatters into millions of tiny, chaotic pieces. But using modern, high-throughput sequencing technology, the team was able to read these billions of fragments and use supercomputers to stitch them back together, reconstructing large portions of the ancient bird's genetic code. Their goal was to definitively test the farming hypothesis. If the birds were farmed, their DNA would show low genetic diversity. Just like modern livestock, cows, chickens, centuries of domestication, inbreeding, and artificial selection from a small founder population would make them all very closely related. If the birds were wild, their DNA would show high genetic diversity, identical to that of a large, free, and healthy wild population. The results, published in the prestigious scientific journal PLOS One, were an earthquake that shattered the old theory. The DNA of the mummified ibises showed enormous genetic diversity. It was just as high as the diversity found in their wild relatives still living in sub-Saharan Africa today. The verdict was indisputable. The birds were not farmed, they were wild. This single genetic fact forces us to completely reimagine the entire cult of Thoth. The picture changes from one of sustainable farming to something far more complex, daring, and dark. The temple complexes were not hatcheries, they were gargantuan processing centers for wild game. Every year, when the massive wild flocks of ibises arrived on the banks of the Nile to herald the flood, an organized, state-sanctioned hunt began. This was not sport, it was an industrial harvest. Imagine brigades of professional trappers, bird catchers of Thoth, wading into the marshes and wetlands of the delta. Imagine them setting up kilometers of fine-spun nets and thousands of hidden snares. Imagine priests directing the operation, setting quotas, and blessing the daily catch as it was brought, flapping and terrified, to the temple walls to be ritually slaughtered. This new model explains everything. It explains the high genetic diversity. It explains why the victims were young and healthy, they were the easiest to catch. And crucially, it explains the fakes. In this wild capture model, the supply of ibises was entirely dependent on the success of the annual hunt. In a year with a low flood, fewer birds might arrive. A poorly managed hunt could fail to meet the temple's quotas, but the pilgrims would still come. The demand for salvation, for a messenger to Thoth, was constant. Faced with a supply chain crisis, the priests and embalmers had a choice: either turn away paying customers and declare the god unavailable, or improvise. They chose to improvise, selling beautifully wrapped packages of mud and chicken bones to devout believers. This new picture transforms our understanding. The entire industry was not agrarian, it was extractive. It was a relentless thousand-year assault on the wild ibis population of Egypt, a sacred hunt that consumed tens of thousands of birds, year after year after year. This leads us to the final, soul-crushing paradox. Here is the heart of the mystery. The African sacred ibis, Thresciornis ethiopicus, the very symbol of Egyptian wisdom, the animal protected by the threat of death, is locally extinct in Egypt. The god has vanished from its own holy land. The last credible sightings of a wild ibis in the Nile Valley date to the mid-19th century. After that, silence. The millennia-long presence of the bird simply ended. How? How could a species that was the object of such intense fanatical worship, a creature whose very presence was considered a divine blessing, be allowed to disappear? The answer is a tragic convergence of factors, a perfect storm of ecological and human pressures. The ibis was killed by 3 successive blows. The first killing blow was the cult itself. For nearly 1,000 years, from roughly 650 BCE to 300 CE, the ibis population was subjected to unrelenting, massive-scale industrial hunting. This sacred cull relentlessly removed the healthiest, strongest young birds from the gene pool. While the hunt was likely managed by priests who may have understood the need to not exhaust the resource, the long-term, cumulative pressure must have been devastating. It likely weakened the Egyptian ibis population, making it a brittle species, highly vulnerable to any future changes in its environment. In a bitter twist of fate, the very act of worship was the first step in the god's destruction. The second killing blow was 19th century modernization. The ibis is a specialist. It is a bird of shallow wetlands, marshes, and flooded plains. It relies on that specific environment to feed. In the 19th century, under the influence of European technologies and a booming population, Egypt began to change. Vast swaths of the Nile Delta's wetlands, the ibis's prime habitat, were systematically drained and reclaimed for agriculture, primarily to create massive cotton plantations. As the marshes vanished, so did the ibis's feeding grounds. The third and final killing blow, the coup de grace, came in the 1960s with what is, ironically, the greatest icon of modern Egypt, the Aswan High Dam. The dam is an engineering marvel. It tamed the Nile, stopped the destructive floods, provided immense hydroelectric power, and allowed for year-round agriculture. But in doing so, it killed the ancient ecosystem of the river. The dam severed the 5,000-year-old symbiotic pulse between the river and the land. The annual life-giving flood, the very event that made the ibis sacred in the first place, stopped forever. The floodplains no longer flooded, the temporary marshes no longer formed. The annual deposit of rich silt and the explosion of snails, amphibians, and insects it supported ceased. The ibis's entire world, its reason for being, was sterilized. The god's arrival had once heralded the flood. Now that the flood was gone, the god had no reason to return. The most profound irony of this entire story is that the sacred ibis, as a species, is not extinct. It thrives today in huge numbers across sub-Saharan Africa. It has even been introduced to Europe, and flocks of them are now considered an invasive pest in parts of France and Spain. The god is not dead. It is merely in exile. But in Egypt, the land that defined it and was defined by it, its ecological niche is forever empty. Today, a tourist can stand in the magnificent ruins of Karnak, walk through the suffocating catacombs of Saqqara, or gaze at the treasures in the Cairo Museum and see thousands of images of the ibis, carved in stone, painted on tomb walls, and wrapped in linen. But they will never see a living one fly across the Nile against the setting sun. The story of the sacred ibis is not just a historical curiosity. It is a chilling 3,000-year-old parable. It is a story about the vast, tragic gap that can exist between worship and understanding. The ancient Egyptians revered the ibis as a divine symbol, but they failed to understand or respect it as a fragile component of a complex ecosystem. Their devotion, blinded by ritual and commercialized by industry, slowly and relentlessly consumed the very thing it claimed to adore. The airless tunnels of Saqqara, filled with their 8 million silent prayers, are not just a tomb. They are a warning, They are a timeless message, whispering to us from across the millennia that our own survival is not guaranteed by the fervor of our beliefs, but by our willingness to understand and protect the intricate, fragile, and sacred world that sustains us. They warn us that it is entirely possible to worship a God so blindly, so obsessively, and so extractively that you end up killing it. A huge thank you to everyone who watched this video to the end. Your support, a like, and a subscription is very important to us. And don't forget to hit the bell icon so you can always stay up to date and never miss our new videos.